Speaker.
Urgent question.
In the UK.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In response to Putin's barbaric acts in Ukraine and against the Ukrainian people, we need to keep all of our energy options open. We've always been clear that the development of shale gas in the UK must be safe and cause minimal disruption and damage to those living and working nearby sites. This is not a new position. Shale gas and new approaches could be part of our future energy mix, but we need to be led by the science and have the support of local communities, and that was in our general election manifesto, which he and I stood on at the last election. The pause on fracking, implemented in November 2019 on the basis of the difficulty in predicting and managing seismic activity caused by fracking, remains in place, and we will continue to be led by the science on our approach. Mr. Speaker, we're clear that shale gas is not the solution to near-term issues. It would take years of exploration and development before commercial quantities of shale gas could be produced. Additionally, fracking relies on a continued series of new wells, each of which produces gas for a relatively short time. Even if the pause were lifted, there is unlikely to be sufficient quantities of gas available to address the high prices affecting all of Western Europe, and would certainly have no effect on prices in the near term. As the Business Secretary has said, we will continue to back our vital North Sea oil and gas sector to maximise domestic production while transitioning to cheaper, cleaner, homegrown power at the same time. Mr. Speaker, we will shortly set out an energy supply strategy which will supercharge our renewable energy and nuclear capacity, as well as supporting our North Sea oil and gas industry.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Alan, last Wednesday, the Secretary of State for Business told this House it did not necessarily make sense to concrete over the wells at the Preston New Road site in Lancashire. Now, given that these are the only two viable wells in the whole of the UK, pouring concrete down them would be the end of the shale gas industry in the UK. And this would be an inappropriate step at this time. And we're in the midst, Mr. Speaker, of an international crisis. And as the Prime Minister himself said, the West has become addicted to Russian gas. And this is something we must rectify immediately. It is a national emergency. And this House was assured last week that both the Business Department and Number 10 agreed that these wells should not be filled. However, government rhetoric is not being matched by action on the ground. And Quadrilla, the company that owns the wells, has spent the last 6 days trying to get hold of anyone at Bays or the Oil and Gas Authority to receive confirmation that they no longer need to carry out this abandonment process. But they are being ignored. Officials are dragging their heels, and now with just days to go, Quadrilla are still legally obliged to plug the wells by the 30th of June, and the OGA keeps confirming this. The Business Secretary says that they should formally request an extension. This is nothing but Jobsworth mentality. But that's just kicking the can down the road, and we'll be back here having the same arguments in a few weeks' time. Instead, can I ask the Business Secretary why he just doesn't give a practical effect to the words that he uttered last week and instruct the OGA to reverse the decision to concrete the wells? That's what they're waiting for. Either the government thinks these wells should be filled, or it doesn't. To concrete or not to concrete is the question. Frack or not to frack. If we don't want to see concrete being poured down our only viable shale gas wells in the middle of an energy crisis, the Business Secretary needs to act quickly. As Western civilisation grapples with an energy crisis, I'm at pains to understand why the government risks jeopardising Britain's long-term energy security over some tiny procedural nonsense. The course of action is clear to me. Now, I hear some chuntering in this House today, but I would challenge any MP, Mr. Speaker, in this House, any MP, to come to my constituents, speak to some real people who are struggling with their gas bills. Not one person in this place has to worry about paying their gas bills, so hang your heads in shame.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you very much for his engagement, and I know that he has got a long-standing interest in energy on a number of different fronts, so I commend him for his continuing interest. First thing I would say, Mr. Speaker, is this, that nothing has changed on government policy in relation to fracking and shale gas. In terms of the international crisis, He says the West is addicted to Russian hydrocarbons. I would say the UK is not. The UK, we import less than 3%, 4% it was last year, but typically less than 3% of our gas from Russia. The figures for oil are higher, but they're nothing like the sort of eye-watering percentages that we see from European friends and partners. And finally, when it comes to the holes in Preston New Road in Lancashire, I can tell him that the Oil and Gas Authority, the independent regulator, has proactively approached Quadrilla as recently as this week to ask if Quadrilla will apply for an extension. However, Quadrilla hasn't made a straightforward application to do so. As with any licensee, if Quadrilla want to extend this deadline, they can apply for a straightforward extension from the Oil and Gas Authority. And, Mr. Speaker, I can tell my honourable friend that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, and I met with the Oil and Gas Authority today, and they are ready to consider Quadrilla's letter and potential application, and the government hopes the regulator would consider it favourably.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me congratulate the honourable gentleman on securing the UQ. I think he's right to try and smoke out the government's position, and it's no wonder he's confused. But he'll still remain confused, I think, after the minister's replies today. Let's be clear, Mr. Speaker. The government placed a moratorium on fracking because they said it was dangerous and could not rule out unacceptable impacts on the local community. The Business Secretary said in 2020 fracking is over. Just a few days ago, he said it would come at a high cost for communities and our precious countryside. Yet last Wednesday, just 3 days later, the same Business Secretary said, and I quote, "The government is open to the idea in the House." But yesterday at Chatham House, the Minister ruled it out. They are completely all over the place on this, Mr. Speaker. So let me ask him some questions, because this does matter. It's about our energy security, it's about communities deeply worried about the impact of fracking and about the climate crisis. Let me ask him this first question first. Has he or his department seen any scientific evidence since the moratorium of 2019 which suggests that fracking might not be dangerous and might be safe? If he does not have any evidence, why is he approaching the Oil and Gas Authority to not concrete over the wells when that was a decision originally made? If he doesn't think fracking is safe, why is he sowing uncertainty in those communities around our country? If he doesn't have any evidence also, will he assure the House that there will be no review of fracking, no nods, no winks, no nudges announced in the relaunch of the government's energy strategy? Clarity on this really matters. And finally, Mr. Speaker, isn't the truth the best thing the government can do to guarantee energy security, and he should just be clear about this, is have a green energy sprint? Ending the onshore wind moratorium, ending the objection to solar power, embracing tidal power, moving forward with nuclear, and a properly funded national energy efficiency programme.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to see him in his place at the dispatch box today. He says he's confused, Mr. Speaker, but I have been absolutely clear that government policy is unchanged. I'm not sure what he finds confusing about government policy being unchanged. It is unchanged from the 2019 manifesto. Now, we did not, in 2019, put our manifesto on an headstone, Mr. Speaker. But I will have to say to him, it is clearly available for anybody to see online what the manifesto pledges that this side of the House all ran on, and government policy is unchanged, Mr. Speaker, from then, with or without an headstone. He is saying that it's sowing uncertainty. No, Mr. Speaker. Actually, we have given absolute certainty here that government policy is unchanged from the pause announced in 2019. There is no review. We still have the pause from December 2019, which would be a science-led policy with the support of local communities if there were to be a change. And then finally, Mr. Speaker, we heard about the green energy sprint. It's absolutely extraordinary. Since he was the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change in 2010, we have increased the proportion of our electricity generation coming from renewables from 7% to 43%. Now, in any normal terms, that would be a sprint, but it's also a marathon in the sense that we have done that over a period of 12 years, almost a sextupling, Mr. Speaker, if I might, of the amount of energy coming from our renewables compared to the time when he was in office. He talks about nuclear, Mr. Speaker. But he will also remember the 1997 Labour manifesto when they said they saw no economic case for new nuclear power stations. And now he has the cheek, Mr. Speaker, to come to the dispatch box today and urge that we get on with nuclear. The government is getting on with nuclear, Mr. Speaker, and is getting on with renewables, doing exactly the green energy sprint he has suggested.
A member whose constituency has been mentioned in this, Mark Menzies.
Just outlined at the start that this does affect my constituency, and I am disappointed that the member for Ashfield did not have the courtesy to give me advance notice he was asking a question pertaining to my constituency. Mr. Speaker, these are not viable wells, and can the Minister just confirm that? The wells in 2012 that caused the first national moratorium were concreted over with the blessing of Quadrilla. The last thing they wanted to do at that point, Mr. Speaker, was frack again in those wells. So they dug 3 miles away. And both those wells, Mr. Speaker, have triggered the second national moratorium. So they are not viable wells. So can the Minister confirm that and stop this nonsense now?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think my honourable friend illustrates the point very well about the importance of keeping local community support if this were to happen. We definitely, as stated in the manifesto, is based on what local communities felt at that time. And I don't think any local community felt it more strongly than his filed. In terms of the actual process here, we have been clear that if Quadrilla were to apply to the Oil and Gas Authority for an extension to extend that deadline, it would be considered by the Oil and Gas Authority in the usual way. And, Mr. Speaker, I repeat that the Secretary of State and I spoke with the Oil and Gas Authority just this morning to confirm that.
Spokesperson Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a rare time in the Chamber, I completely agree with the Honourable Member for Fylde and the Minister's opening remarks. Now is not the time for knee-jerk reactions. Given we've got this energy crisis, now is the time to stay strategic and not make daft decisions. And it's quite clear that doing fracking would not do anything to change the West's reliance on gas, even if, say, the UK doesn't rely on Russian gas. The Minister can reconfirm that fracking wouldn't release enough gas that would actually change the international market price anyway, so we'll still be paying the same wholesale prices. And isn't it the case there isn't enough geological and scientific core and information to the right depths to actually understand the viability of extraction, let alone the risks of seismic tremors that we've already heard occurred at Pesson Road, and therefore fracking should be ruled out the way Scottish Government's done it? And isn't it the case that we need to heavily invest in renewables? We keep hearing about nuclear from the two front benches. Commit to £63 billion of capital and financing costs to Sizewell C is madness. It should be straightforward renewable energy. I keep going on about pump storage hydro. Last week the Secretary of State said, I've been going on about pump storage hydro for 18 months. It's a good solution, but it needs to assess value for money. When are we going to get that value for money? When are we going to get a change to the transmission grid charging system, which is blocking deployment of Scottish renewables? And we need to invest more in tidal stream, increase the floating offshore target and set an onshore wind target as well. And let's maximise investment in renewable energy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank him for that response. And look, he is right. In the first part of what he says, fracking is unlikely to change prices on gas, or UK frack is unlikely to change it, and certainly unlikely to change it quickly, which is what I said in my opening statement. He's also right to point to the importance of following the science, and geological information is really, really important. However, Mr. Speaker, I do have to say to him on nuclear, he continues to be wrong. The SNP's ideological, hardcore opposition to nuclear is against Scotland's interests. We've just seen the closure of the Hunterston nuclear power station, which provided enough nuclear energy to supply every home in Scotland for 31 years, Mr. Speaker. It was a great Scottish as well as UK solution. And when it comes to our other great source of gas, the North Sea, Mr. Speaker, I would like to see the SNP approach becoming more constructive and more supportive of the North Sea transition deal that the UK government did a year ago.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Speaker,
And may I support what my right honourable friend is saying about the need for more renewables, the need for nuclear, and that we all support the objective of net zero by 2050. But we now are in a gas supply crisis. The government insists we are in a European market. Europe is heavily dependent on Russia. We need to produce as much gas as we can. And it's a very simple question. Is shale an option for the government in the immediate term or not? That's what we need to know. Otherwise, the wells will be concreted over, which is what the government said they don't want.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for that question. I particularly thank him for his support for renewables, nuclear and for net zero. All of those three things belong together and right at the centre of government policy. He said it was a gas supply crisis. Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't characterise it that way. The UK has got very secure sources of gas supply. Around about 50% comes from the UK continental shelf. A further 30% comes from Norway, our great friends and allies, NATO allies. 20% is bought on the international market. So, Mr. Speaker, I don't share. There is an issue with price, obviously, but I don't share his characterisation of a gas supply crisis. And finally, is shale an option? Look, as I repeat again, government policy in this area is unchanged. If people can show that the scientific base and the local community support is there, then government policy would be to allow shale if that turned out to be where those two key considerations led to, Mr. Speaker.
Davis.
Yeah, can I say, Mr. Speaker, as the Council of Europe rapporteur on hydraulic fracturing, that the Minister may know that of the methane produced by fracking, 5% is leaked through fugitive emissions. And as methane is 80 times worse than CO2 for global warming, that makes fracking worse than coal for global warming. So instead of looking at fracking, will he redouble his efforts on renewables in England in terms of wind farms, in Wales in terms of marine, and also look to store renewable energy in organic batteries that are produced on scale, are cheap and also don't end up with pollutants?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there's a few questions within that. In terms of his data on emissions, the one thing, it would be impossible to really judge what emissions on UK fracking would look like, because there hasn't been data produced on that. What I would say, he says that fracking is worse than coal. What I can be certain of is that LNG has more emissions in the production of LNG than there is in the UK continental shelf natural gas. That is for sure, 2.5 times as much. So I would expect him to be rallying behind our call to maintain the UK continental shelf production going on at the moment and to import, hopefully, less LNG. And then he talks about redoubling renewables, Mr. Speaker. Well, you know, we have the Europe's largest installed offshore wind capacity. We are already committed to quadrupling that, Mr. Speaker. That is twice the rate of the redoubling he's calling for.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The moratorium introduced seismic limits that were ridiculously low and appeared to be written by someone who didn't understand the Richter scale. Should it not be the case that these decisions should be taken by local planning authorities with community involvement and set at limits similar to that we might see for development in London, for example? And should we not be locking in community benefits of fracking sites?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he mentions, thank him indeed for his question, and also he's somebody else who is very, very supportive of government policy on energy, particularly in nuclear, which I strongly commend him for. He mentioned seismic limits. What I would say, Mr. Speaker, I wasn't the Energy Minister at the time, but I believe that tens of thousands of complaints came into the Royal Geological Society at the time of the drilling, which I think showed, if you like, the magnitude of the public impact of some of that drilling at the time. And finally, as point on local consent, I refer back to what I said earlier in terms of the importance of this, the need to bring local communities on board in any of these projects, Mr. Speaker, in pretty much every type of energy. You need to bring the local community on board, and that is the case here as well.
Samuel Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's been much hand-wringing in this House about the cost of energy, energy security, our reliance on outside sources, and yet within our own country we have sufficient gas to do us for 50 years. Does the Minister think it's sensible to turn her back on the jobs, to turn her back on the taxes, and to spend money buying gas overseas when we've got an indigenous source, a pipeline across the United Kingdom, and one of the richest and deepest shale gas seams in the world?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are not turning our back on anybody. We have been absolutely clear that keeping our energy diversity is important to us, vital to us. Keeping our energy security is vital to us. So we are not turning our back on anybody or anything. But here, government policy is unchanged. We need to see both the scientific evidence and the local community support to be able to proceed, which is what we laid out in our 2019 manifesto.
Mr. Speaker, it's reassuring to hear from the government that the community support is going to be at the heart of any decisions, because I can tell the Minister that in Rother Valley there is no community support for fracking. In Harthill and Woodsets, where there are potential wells, nobody wants it. In fact, in Woodsets, fracking site is mere yard from an old people retirement home. Can the Minister confirm that this government focuses more on renewables, not on fracking? Because every single minute this government spends talking about fracking is a minute not spent talking about renewables. Is a minute engineers are not working on renewables, and we need to get that online, not fracking.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he again makes a really strong point, my honourable friend, who I know also takes a strong interest in energy matters, particularly on renewables. But he makes a really strong point on the need to keep local support and local consent on these projects. And he's quite right. The focus on renewables is very strongly there. It's the Prime Minister himself who describes the country as the Saudi Arabia of wind. The commitment to renewables comes right from the very top of our government, throughout the government, Mr. Speaker.
Catherine Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member for Ashfield in his question characterises his constituents as being real people. Can I reassure the member that the people of Lancashire are real people? The people of Lancaster and Fleetwood that I represent are completely opposed to fracking in Lancashire, and I'm sure I speak for my friend from Fylde as well. The reality is that shale gas is currently paused. So can the Minister, when he says that we would need support from local communities, can he be sure that he is hearing loud and clear from Lancashire that Lancashire said no, people in Lancashire do not want fracking? Can he reassure my constituents that these wells will be concreted over and that the government will consider turning this pause into a ban on fracking?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what happens to the well is currently a matter of discussion, or soon to be discussion, between the Oil and Gas Authority and Quadrilla. But can I come back to what she said in terms of maintaining local support and local community support is incredibly important. I've discovered, Mr. Speaker, as Energy Minister, stating the obvious to some extent, but for all energy projects, you need local community support, whether it be offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, and this would be absolutely no exception to that.
Gillette. Dave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I pay tribute to my honourable friend for Fylde, who's done so much over many years to support his constituents, who've been adamantly opposed to shale gas extraction. However, the opposition talk, frankly, a load of tosh when it comes to how we're going to meet our net zero ambitions. My right honourable friend on the front bench has set out exactly the amazing achievements in renewables and in our commitment to achieving net zero. Nevertheless, for the exponential increase in electricity demand to make that transition, we have to look at the lowest fossil fuel, which is gas. And if we have safe and secure resources in this country, which we undoubtedly do, it is absolutely right that we talk to communities about whether they would like to have free gas in return for committing to shale gas extraction in their area. That is only right. Thank you.
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank her for her question. In terms of renewables, actually, a huge part of the government's delivery on renewables in the last 12 years is down to her. First as Energy Minister and then as Secretary of State at my department. She, in both those roles, drove forward a big increase, and some of the really, sometimes the tough decisions to get made on renewables were made by her. So I absolutely pay tribute to my right honourable friend. In terms of gas, she is important. She's absolutely right. The Climate Change Committee itself has said that gas can still be consistent with reaching net zero in 2050, and let's face it, is absolutely vital for our energy mix today. And she also makes some really strong points on how we keep local consent and local communities on board, which I think, as with all forms of energy, is one of the central points that this government is keen to maintain.
Mr Mallett.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The government say that the policy hasn't changed, but I wonder why it's so hard to make a decision. Ellesmere Port had a public inquiry over 3 years ago for a shale gas development, and we still haven't had a decision from the Minister as to whether that's going to proceed. Isn't it time that the government stopped trying to have their cake and eat it and actually made a decision and rejected fracking once and for all?
Well, Mr Speaker, the policy is clear and laid out in our 2019 manifesto. It's not possible for me at the dispatch box to comment on individual decisions as they may be being assessed by the department, but the policy in 2019 is clear that there is a pause on future fracking developments.
Paul Maynard.
Minister for what he has just said, which my constituents will welcome. Many in this House seem to think that I represent South Dakota rather than Blackpool, which has 8 out of the 10 most deprived neighbourhoods in the country, all of whom are deeply, deeply fearful of higher costs of energy. But does he not agree that this debate about fracking is a complete distraction from the task in hand of finding speedy, effective and efficient measures to reduce energy costs in the short run, not a further long-term gamble on unproven technology that is many, many years away from delivering anything meaningful to my constituents?
Speaker, I thank him, and he's represented Blackpool incredibly ably for the last 12 years and knows his community well. He makes again the strong point about the importance of community consent, and he also makes the point about speedy implementation of alternative, cheaper and cleaner forms of energy. That is why we announced just a couple of weeks ago an annual CFD contracts for different renewables auction on an annual basis, Mr Speaker, to do precisely that.
We're a Hobhouse.
Mr Speaker, renewables are the cheapest form of energy and it is a well-established industry. Fracking is not, and reading the room, I think it is very clear that it's understood here. So why doesn't the government ban fracking altogether? But my question is again about renewables. The government has already made new commitments for renewables, but isn't now the time, in this new challenge, there is a new challenge, you might not call it a crisis, to actually double and triple on the plants that are already in the pipeline and make even more renewables and plan for more renewables than the government is currently doing?
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank you for that question. She calls on us to double or treble renewables. That isn't good enough, Mr Speaker. We are going for the quadrupling of our offshore wind capacity in this decade. It is already the largest in Europe, Mr Speaker. We are not just doubling, we are not just tripling, we are quadrupling, Mr Speaker, that capacity.
Right.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Around 85% of the beautiful constituency of Thirsk Malton is covered by shale gas exploration licences, and we will need gas for many, many decades into the future. So in principle, I'm not against it. I happen to think it'd be easier doing exploration in the North Sea. The energy experts that spoke to the Treasury Select Committee yesterday were very clear. One thing that's hampering that is the lack of willingness from our banks to extend monies to invest in exploration because they're focusing on ESG goals rather than the national interest. Would my honourable friend work with the Treasury to make sure our banks do support exploration, because we will need this gas into the future?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that incredibly important question. First of all, I agree with him. I'm in principle not against shale gas either. But he also raised a really important question about banks and lending, particularly to the North Sea. And let me be absolutely clear from this dispatch box. This government welcomes continuing investment in the North Sea. That is absolutely part of our energy security, part of our energy resilience. If there's any further sign that banks need a signal from the government, either from Bayes or from Treasury, let me send that signal today. We want to see continuing investment in our UK continental shelf, Mr Speaker.
Steve McKay.
Does the Minister accept that biogas from landfill and sewage waste produces cheaper electricity than almost any other form of gas? And if that's so, Could we do more to up the volume of that production, as I think National Grid suggested some 7 years ago?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he raises also a very good point, and a strong point. I think in terms of what defines something as being cheaper, there's different ways to cut that. It will depend on what the prevailing prices today are of alternative sources of energy. And he will know that, for example, the gas price is something like more than 15 times its 5-year historic high. So a lot depends on what the other prices are that are out there. But as I said earlier, there will be a strategy being launched by the government before the end of the month, which will address a number of these different questions in terms of where our energy supply will be coming from in future years.
Craig McKinley.
The diverse organisations such as the Climate Change Committee and the Net Zero Scrutiny Group that I chair, I think agree on one thing, and that is that gas is going to be part of our energy mix to 2050 and beyond, which makes domestic supply a very sensible endeavour. Can I just put to the Minister the benefits, 75,000 potential jobs, tens of billions of investment, billions in terms of tax revenues, massive savings of CO2 compared to LNG inputs, which are truly horrific on CO2, given that they come in on a diesel ship, and, of course, the balance of payments positivity. Is there anything in that list that my right honourable friend disagrees with? And finally, could I implore him to send a note of thanks to the US government, who took the dash to shale gas extraction some time ago, and it's on the back of that that they've mitigated a lot of our energy failures.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank him for that question and his continued interest. And I'm always happy to meet with his group to discuss these issues. He's absolutely right. Domestic supply is very, very important. Look, this would not be the time to be wanting to increase imports of foreign LNG. That's one of the reasons why we want to see a robust UK continental shelf producing UK natural gas. The points he makes about investment, jobs, tax revenues and so on, that will obviously would be considered in the round. But I would also point out the earlier points about seeing the scientific evidence first and seeing the local community support as well.
Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many Wirral West residents are extremely concerned that Petroleum Exploration and Development Licence 184 covers Wirral West, and so the government's failure to ban fracking leaves my constituency at risk of this dangerous technology that would extract fossil fuels at the very time that we should be moving to renewables. Now, I led a successful campaign against underground coal gasification in the DS stream in 2013, and last month the government told me that the government no longer supports the development of UCG. So can the Minister reconfirm whether that position is still the case or whether it's changed, and will he ban both fracking and UCG?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've laid out very, very clearly that our policy on fracking is unchanged. When she mentions, she also illustrates well also the need to keep community support. And when it comes to renewables, I'm afraid to say this government's record is one of the very best in the world in delivering on renewables, the world's largest installed offshore wind capacity, a new dedicated pot for tidal, a lot of progress on solar, a lot of progress on onshore wind as well. All of these things are helping the UK produce a very diversified set of energy sources, Mr. Speaker, which I think is a key part of our response to the current crisis.
May
I commend the Minister for his clear answers today that if an application for shale gas is made, there will be no political objection from the government, but it must be determined on the basis of the support of the local community, by which I presume he means the local planning process. Can the Minister confirm that this approach, based on local community support, will also apply to large solar farms?
Well, we have an established process in place for large solar farms, and I'm not changing policy on that. What I would say to him is that solar offers a great addition to our armoury of renewables, has been a big success in this country in recent times. When it comes to commenting on individual applications, obviously I can't do that because that is a quasi-judicial role of the Department for my honourable friend, the Secretary of State.
Mr. Roberts.
26, Wales signed up to the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, and we have comprehensively rejected fracking or any new hydrocarbon developments. Shale production will not meet our current energy needs, will take too long, will be too expensive, and will condemn our climate targets. Will the Minister assure me that he will respect Wales's opposition to fracking, honour our COP26 pledges, and not give in to climate deniers and fossil fuel opportunists?
Ooh, hear, hear.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would remind you that energy is reserved. However, I refer back to my earlier points about local community support being important in all of our energy policy as well.
Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, and I say to my honourable friend, the important thing in all of these things is to remain pragmatic. We will need gas even after we hit 2050, because gas, for example, will be the way in which we make hydrogen, and hydrogen clearly is part of the way ahead. Now, the reality is that he knows that, and so I would ask him that when it comes to whether it's shale gas or the North Sea, we should remain completely pragmatic, as Conservative governments should be, and recognise that fact, and not allow this kind of new ideological religion to take over everything and damage. If we want to ask somebody, ask them whether they feel like their gas prices should be rising at the rate they are, or they'd like lower gas prices.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree with him. Absolutely agree with him. I agree with him on the importance of hydrogen, and I agree with him on the importance of being pragmatic. He and I were both elected on a 2019 Conservative Party general election manifesto, and government policy is unchanged from that manifesto. That, if you like, Mr. Speaker, is the height of pragmatism, is to stick to our manifesto and to keep our options open.
Paul Longfield.
Speaker, it's really unfortunate that the boss of Quadrillo has, with the support of the honourable member for Ashfield, used the Ukraine crisis to reopen the discredited case for fracking. So will the Minister simply agree that we are better investing in the renewable technologies of the future, both in terms of our energy security and in meeting our climate commitments?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are investing in renewables. We are investing massively. Our current round of allocations in the contracts for different auction is larger than any previous round. Mr. Speaker, we've announced big support for offshore wind within it, big support for other technologies, and for the first time a dedicated £20 million pot for tidal.
Speaker, real projects take time and money, as my right honourable friend knows all too well, of course, through his work on nuclear and elsewhere. And that's why I think we're here today, because there's been inadequate communication between the decision-makers in authority and the company, who know they have to act now if they're to meet the deadline to put concrete in the wells. Will my right honourable friend personally intervene, please, to make sure that there is effective communication between the authorities and the company, so that we don't have to bring UQs like this forward to the House?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank him for that, and I thank him also for his interest, ongoing interest in all matters relating to energy. I do have to say to him that Quadrillo were told 2 years ago, in June 2021, almost 2 years ago, of the requirement to decommissioning the 2 wells by the end of June 2022. So they were given a huge amount of notice to do this. I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, that the Secretary of State and I had spoken to the Oil and Gas Authority today, and I believe that further communication will happen with the company.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad the Minister has acknowledged that fracking would do nothing to increase our energy security, given that the energy would then be sold on global markets at international prices. And I'm also grateful that he talks of the importance of public consent, and he will know that given only 14% of people actually support fracking, and given that it would require 6,000 wells simply to replace half of the gas that we're currently using, that's not going to happen anytime soon. But can I urge him to do more on energy demand? This whole debate has been about energy supply. Where is the action on reducing demand? That is where the government is dragging its feet, and it needs to change now.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have comprehensive investments going on through the heat and building strategy and other initiatives to make sure that energy demand is also addressed as well. But can I just say this, Mr. Speaker, because I think she missed the last couple of occasions to put questions at the dispatch box. One thing I am sure of is I'm very glad we didn't follow the advice of the Green Party, back in 1989, Mr. Speaker, at the time when they scored their record score in an election, 15%, their advice was it was impossible to take action on emissions while simultaneously growing the economy. And I'm really glad that we decided to ignore that advice, Mr. Speaker, because in the intervening 30 years we have grown the economy by 78% and reduced our emissions by 44%, comprehensively proving the Green Party totally wrong.
Anthony Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I speak as Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the Environment. After the 1973 oil price shock wreaked economic havoc across the Western world, different countries responded in different ways to make sure that it never happened again. Denmark went for increasing wind power, Japan went for increasing solar, France went for increasing nuclear power. In Britain, we went for increasing oil production in the North Sea. Does my right honourable friend agree that we should learn the lessons from history to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes, and that the response to high international energy, oil and gas prices shouldn't be to press pause on net zero, but to push full steam ahead with it, growing renewables and growing nuclear power?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that question. I think I'm meeting with his APPG either this week or next week, and I'm really looking forward to that. He makes some really strong points. Mr. Speaker, net zero is not part of the problem. Net zero is part of the solution when it comes to both the transition and to energy security. He asked about not repeating the mistakes of the past. He mentioned nuclear. Well, I'm glad, actually, I'm going to put on record, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to see the conversion of the party opposite from their manifesto in 1997, saying they were anti-nuclear, to now actually backing the government's nuclear programme. I welcome that conversion.
My constituents in Formby have experienced test drilling, and they have very real safety concerns. I can assure the Minister there is widespread community opposition in my constituency to fracking. So will he give my constituents certainty that fracking is ruled out? I'll tell him how he can do it. He can end the moratorium on onshore wind, and he can also give full-throated support to tidal energy, both of which are very realistic options in the Liverpool City region.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have just announced a dedicated pot for tidal energy in the CFD round. I think in terms of providing certainty, can I make a suggestion to him, Mr. Speaker, that he goes back to the Conservative Party manifesto of 2019? Policy is unchanged from that. So can I make a suggestion, a friendly cross-party suggestion, that if he wants to give his constituencies some assurance that he perhaps reprint the Conservative Party manifesto in full and distribute that to all of his constituents and say, here the policy is unchanged?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Gas suppliers are asking energy-intensive businesses, including a major paper mill in my constituency, for very large upfront payments. So as the government reviews its energy strategy, will my honourable friend look at a proposal for a government-backed payment guarantee scheme to help companies manage cash flow and avoid the need for prepayment?
Speaker, of course we are acutely aware of the difficulties that some energy-intensive industries are facing. My ministerial colleague, the member for Derbyshire North East, is looking at this all the time. We review the situation all the time, but these kind of schemes are often a matter for the Treasury and for agreement with the Treasury.
Matt Weston.
Back in 2014, the people of Warwickshire were very vocal in their opposition of proposed fracking licences across Warwickshire by Clough Natural Resources. I'm sure the Minister would agree that, given our objective must be about reducing energy demand, why was it then that his government tore up the net zero carbon homes legislation of the previous Labour government, which would have seen 1 million new homes built that would be zero carbon from 2016, reducing the demand of energy in this country?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think he's inviting me to go back down memory lane to 2010. So I will tell him this. Let me tell him this, Mr. Speaker, that thanks to the actions of this government, the number of homes that are energy efficient and meet clear those minimal criteria has massively increased in the last 12 years of this government. Making sure energy efficient homes are there is something that this government is delivering on.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Evidence to the Treasury Select Committee yesterday reiterated really that fracking is not worth doing, but also pointed out that part of the problem we're in is the UK Government's poor and inconsistent stewardship of our resources in the North Sea compared to our neighbours in Norway, who have had a long-term and consistent plan for them. So could he tell us what commitment the Government really has to its own transition plans, which was in question yesterday, and will they invest in renewables, which will be to the benefit of not only the environment, our economy, but to our energy security in years to come?
Well, Mr Speaker, I'll give her two pieces of advice. The first is that she herself might want to make a visit to North East Scotland and just see where the people there, and particularly the people in and around Aberdeen, who they think is more supportive of the offshore sector in its entirety, including oil and gas, including renewables, the Scottish Government or the UK Government. The answer is normally the UK Government. And then, Mr Speaker, she asked me, am I still backing the North Sea transition deal? Well, Mr Speaker, it is a deal done by this government. Of course we're still backing it. I keep asking her colleagues, do they back it? And I never hear anything, whether they back the North Sea transition deal. If she is now announcing that the SNP is backing it, Mr Speaker, then that's one clear gain from today's session contributions from the Scottish Nationalist Party.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's time that the government's policy moved from a pause on shale gas production to a full stop. The people of this country have moved on, and so has the science. Just on Friday, the honourable member's friend, the member for Mid-Norfolk, was in York looking at the Bio-Yorkshire project, which will change and transform the future of our energy supply through the biofuel industry. Why not invest in that instead of this old technology that simply will not deliver?
Well, Mr Speaker, we do invest in biofuels, and my honourable friend, the member for Mid-Norfolk, in his visit, he had a very good and productive visit, and I thank everybody at York who received him. But we do invest, and we do make sure that is part of our diversified energy mix. Diversification is absolutely key in the space of energy, Mr Speaker, as other countries have perhaps learned to their cost.
No, not yet. Margaret Ferry has still got to come in.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We cannot allow the current crisis to be used as an excuse to greenlight fracking, and any potential benefits, as the Minister said, to prices wouldn't even be seen for years to come. The Government should be focusing on identifying other solutions like investment in wind or solar power, or using new agricultural policy schemes in the UK to increase nitrogen use efficiency to reduce the waste of artificial nitrogen fertilisers. So can the Minister confirm what alternative projects that he is considering?
Well, I thank her for that question. Certainly when it comes to hydrogen, I can confirm one project pretty near to her constituency, the Whiteley wind farm, just south of Glasgow, which I came to in November, looking at how wind power, in this case onshore wind power, can be converted into hydrogen with a £9.8 million UK government support, and that will actually drive buses and dust carts in Glasgow City for many decades to come. I think it's exactly that sort of innovative project that the UK government is backing.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I asked the Minister very carefully about whether he would respect Wales's policy of refusing further coal and gas. I'm sure most of the people in this House will appreciate that this aspect of energy is devolved to Wales. The Minister replied to me that energy was a reserved matter. Could the Speaker advise me as to how the awareness would be established within this government as to which powers are reserved and which powers are devolved to Wales?